Welcome, and thank you everyone for joining us for today's talk on disability and reparations from haunting to hope with Dr. Linda Steele. My name is Lauren Shalish. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Urban Education here at Rutgers-Newark. For a visual description, I'm a white woman in her 40s with long red hair and blue eyes. Today's event is part of the Mellon Foundation's Sawyer Seminar Series on Reparative Futures. Our thanks go to the Mellon Foundation and our Rutgers-Newark sponsors for making this webinar possible. This event is also part of Rutgers University's month-long disability awareness programming, which is a university-wide effort to increase understanding about the disabled experience and center local knowledges and lived experience as expertise. Today's event is on disability and reparations. Before I introduce Dr. Steele, I wanted to provide brief context for our participants on the relevance of this issue to our work here at Rutgers and the state of New Jersey. In the words of Dr. Steele, quote, "One of the primary oppressions experienced by disabled people is that they are marked as perpetually available for all kinds of intrusions, public and private. Disability is a lawful and legitimate basis on which to circumvent equality and drastically shift the thresholds of violence and justice, whether in immigration restrictions, exploitative wages and sheltered workshops, non-consensual sterilization, the removal of children from disabled parents by the social welfare system, and segregation, even caging in schools." To put it simply, today, people with disabilities are more likely to be found in spaces of confinement than anywhere else. Confinement can mean prisons and jails, and also nursing homes, psychiatric facilities, restrictive special education placements, sheltered workshops, hospitals, and foster care placements and family removal systems. Confinement also exists in interpersonal, carcerally influenced dynamics, like prescribing practices, the maintenance of chemical incarceration, and in any number of decontextualized and intensely gendered and racialized DSM definitions. Higher education is far more responsible for all of this than it wants to admit, given its ownership in the training and credentialing of various service sectors that pervade the lives of the disabled or those marked and politicized as such. Colleges and universities, particularly those with medical colleges, schools of education, and law schools like our own, have historically been tied to the promotion and maintenance of eugenics, or the science of designing a, quote, master race of people. It was assumed that eugenics would be a benefit to society and that it would result in a dramatic reduction of costs of having to care for the, quote, sick and incarcerated. Such labels of deficiency were believed to be genetically inherited qualities rather than products of racialized, ableist, and sanist social inequities. Eugenics flourished in higher education, whereby graduates from fields of psychology, medicine, and education were hired as faculty and researchers at local institutions that warehoused the disabled. Medical testing and experimentation was quick to infiltrate the field of education, where scholars believed intelligence was a fixed, biological, racially determined characteristic. Eugenics attempted to justify binary constructions of normal, pathological, autonomous, dependent, and competent citizen ward of the state, thereby subjecting bodies and minds to the horrors of what Foucault describes as biopower. The University of Virginia was an epicenter of the eugenics movement, as was Henry Goddard's rampant research conducted here in New Jersey on the scientific category of moron. Eugenics was largely sanctioned practice here in the US from the 1800s to the 1960s and was central to many research agendas, faculty promotional materials, and funding opportunities in higher education and related research partners. It flourished because, writes Erevellis, Erevelles, quote, "The logic of disability as a dangerous pathology helped create a moral panic and required that something be done about this rampant social liability." Here in New Jersey, we have one of the top 5 highest rates of institutionalization in the entire country. Today, around 2,000 people with developmental disabilities alone in New Jersey are housed in nursing homes, contrary to their wishes and in violation of their constitutional rights, because the state does not properly evaluate their needs or give them the option of living more independently. But as a state, we are also home to the founding of the National Black Disability Coalition. Dorothea Dix was, at the time, a radical disability organizer, and her founding of the Trenton Psychiatric Hospital was considered a revolutionary design at the time of its inception. And it is now state code to teach disability history in schools. And here at Rutgers-Newark, we founded the first disability studies program at the university, one of only a handful in the nation. So to keep this momentum and learning going, we are honored by Dr. Linda Steele's presence with us today. She is a leading scholar on this topic of disability and reparations. Dr. Steele is an associate professor at University of Technology Sydney Law Faculty and adjunct associate professor at University of South Australia. She's a visiting scholar at Harvard University and currently leading a program of research titled Truth, Justice, and Repair, exploring how we reckon with and repair the harms of violence, institutionalization, and segregation of disabled people. She is the author of Disability, Criminal Justice, and Law, Reconsidering Court Diversion, and co-editor of Sites of Conscience, Place, Memory, and the Project of Deinstitutionalization, The Legacies of Institutionalization, and Normalcy and Disability. I also just want to add, in addition to her brilliance and scholarly contribution, she's just a lovely person to spend time with. And she's doing today's webinar from Australia, where it is already Friday, and it's already very early in the morning. So thank you, Dr. Steele, for your presence today, and for the thoughtful words we're about to hear in your lecture that will remain with us in the years to come. A reminder to our audience members to please use the Q&A feature on Zoom, as we'll have time at the end of the lecture for questions and answers. Dr. Steele, welcome.
Thank you, Lauren, for that nice introduction, but also, for setting the context locally in relation to your state and nationally as well. So I'd just like to begin by acknowledging that I'm presenting on the ancestral lands of the Wadi Wadi people of Dharawal country. I'd like to pay respect to elders, past, present, and emerging, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land, and noting that sovereignty over this land has never been ceded. I'd just like to thank Professor Shalish for the invitation to speak today. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to share some of the research and advocacy I've been involved in, and looking forward to hearing during the discussion from folks' experiences in the US. I was fortunate to visit America. I was there a few weeks ago and was able to see firsthand some of the work that's happening there. So just to give a visual description, I'm a white woman in my 40s, and I have shoulder-length brown hair, and I'm sitting with a blurred background in my house because it's 6 a.m. So just to the next slide, please. So just to give a warning first that the nature of the topic is that it will cover a variety of issues that are understandably potentially distressing to folks. So we'll be looking at issues of violence, institutionalization, and forced treatment. So just to the next slide. So today I'll be focusing on the question of redress for disability institutions. And the key question I'd like to explore is, if we accept that disability institutions caused harm, why and how do we redress that harm? So I'll look at this question through first giving a little bit of an overview of disability institutions and the harm that has occurred there, then looking at the disability human rights basis for truth-telling and reparations, a little bit about what truth-telling and reparations are, and then I'll turn to some examples that are already happening in this context in relation to disabled people. And I hope that this content isn't too basic, or I hope that it provides some foundation for some of the other discussions you'll be having in this lecture series and in your studies and advocacy. So just to the next slide. So just to kind of situate us all in the presentation, I'd just like to begin by inviting everyone to reflect on how our discussions today might connect with your context. So whether that's your studies and professional practice, or your own personal context. So I'm mindful that there are many people who might be listening today who are themselves disabled, or who have disabled ancestor, family member, friend, or colleague. So the statistics tell us that 1 in 4 Americans are disabled, so it's highly likely that we all have connections or are ourselves disabled. And the image on this slide is of a group of disabled people gathered together, talking and laughing. So you might also, another way you might think about your connections to today's topic is that you might live near a former disability institution. For example, I know that there would be many institutions within New Jersey, but there's an institution that I'm going to be talking a bit about throughout this presentation, which is quite a famous one, called Penhurst State School and Hospital. This was operated in Pennsylvania, and I checked on Google Maps, and that's about 2 hours from where you're situated. So yeah, and obviously, as Lauren said, Professor Shalish said, there would be many others close by as well. And the image here, I've included the location of Penhurst and some photos of Penhurst when I visited there recently. But while I'm focused on the kind of large institutions, many of which have closed, there are many other disability segregated spaces that you might live near or frequent on a daily basis, or go near. So segregated schools, segregated employment or sheltered workshops, residential facilities, group homes, nursing homes, hospitals, prisons, all of these places are places where disabled people are incarcerated or segregated and subject to violence. Slide, please. This presentation might also matter, and Professor Shalish has already mentioned this, depending on your career plans. So often when we think about violence or injustice, we might think about interpersonal violence, kind of something that happens between two individuals without the state being aware, or secretly in the private sphere and so on. But violence and injustice against disabled people, much of that was and is legal, and is not done by a private individual, but is done by professionals and by helping and health professionals that we often associate with benevolence and care. So many helping and health professionals were complicit in disability institutions and eugenics, and Professor Shalish has already introduced the concept of eugenics. I've just put up on this slide a famous image from the Second International Congress of Eugenics, which was a meeting held in 1921. And this image really illustrates the role that was designed into eugenics, the role for different professions and academic disciplines. So the image depicts a leafy tree with its roots drawn in as well, and across the trunk of the tree is a banner that reads eugenics, and there's a message with that says eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. And then each of the roots of the tree is labelled with a different discipline. So these disciplines that are put on each of the roots include education, law, the discipline I teach in, medicine, sociology, psychology, politics. And under all those roots, there's text that states, like a tree, eugenics draws its materials from many sources and organises them into a harmonious entity. Now, of course, these professions have developed since this illustration, but as I'll discuss later, often there continue to be traces or significant signs of eugenics in current day knowledge and practice. And so it's really important for all of us who are studying to become professionals or who are professionals to reckon with the role of us as individual professionals, but as our professional groups as a whole. Okay, so next slide, please. So what are disability institutions? So disability institutions historically were large-scale residential settings specifically for disabled people. And they particularly targeted people labelled in contemporary terms as having intellectual disability or developmental disability. And in these settings, disabled people were congregated in large numbers and kept separate from the rest of the community. They had no choice living there, no choice when they could leave. They didn't have control over their daily living circumstances. And often these disability institutions were on large areas of land with farms. And sometimes in Australia, many of these were bordered by water as well. So they were quite physically isolated. And the image on this slide is of a former disability institution in my home state of New South Wales. It was on a small island that was situated in a river, and the buildings basically sit across the whole island. So that was quite a physically isolated place. So next slide. So millions of disabled people globally are currently in institutions or have had that experience during the 20th and 21st centuries. Institutionalisation of disabled people is the most pervasive form of segregation, discrimination and exclusion of disabled people, keeping them separated throughout their lives and even in death. So last century, there wasn't, particularly earlier 20th century, there was not a lot of community support for disabled people and their families. Families, if they had a disabled child, might be told by doctors or nurses that the best thing they could do would be to put their disabled child in an institution. And if they followed those instructions, they might then be told, don't visit that person, sometimes for a few weeks, but sometimes longer term, they might be told simply to put them in there and forget about them. So some disabled people grew up in institutions with little or no connection with their families. And that certainly impacted the person in the institution, but also had ramifications for their siblings in particular and whole families, younger generations not knowing this family member existed. Disabled people in institutions were socially isolated. They were denied personal and medical care. There was a lot of understaffing or unskilled staff in institutions. The living conditions were very poor. There was overcrowding. The buildings might be inaccessible, particularly if people had physical disability. And there was just a pervasive approach of violence in terms of even how people were cared for on a daily basis. One example that I came across the other day in doing some research, which is particularly disturbing, was that at Penhurst, which is the institution I mentioned earlier, disabled people who bit someone, and that we can imagine in such distressing circumstances why people might engage in that behaviour, they would have all of their teeth removed. So that was the kind of response, and that would play out in other ways. So the use of violence or restraint or medication to respond to people's behaviour, which was might instead be interpreted as distress or resistance or attempts to communicate in a very difficult and oppressive context. Medical experimentation also occurred in disability institutions without consent. So institutions kind of had a captive population that scientists and researchers could exploit without any real concern for consent or ethics of what was happening there, because these places were closed. Disabled people were also subject to sterilisation, and sometimes this was rationalised very perversely as a response to sexual or the risk of sexual assault. So the idea that, well, women in particular need to be sterilised to protect them from sexual assault. But of course, this isn't going to stop the violence and arguably encourages it by making it easier to hide. Disabled people were also subject to restraint and seclusion, so being locked in rooms, strapped to chairs, detained in a cot, being given sedatives and so on. And they were also subjected to forced labour, so they contributed to the building of some institutions or some of the additional buildings on those grounds. And they also contributed to the operations of the institutions. So those institutions that were on large land holdings that had farms, disabled people who were incarcerated there would be working on those farms. They might work in the kitchen or the laundry. This could be to sustain the institution itself, or it could be for profit, so providing services to local communities, or they could be providing personal care to other residents, and that was particularly the case where there was understaffing. So some disabled people died in institutions, some people's remains were returned to the families or towns, but for others, they are buried on the grounds of institutions in unmarked graves. So disability institutions are connected to the logics of eugenics, and this means that they are associated with these hierarchies of abnormality in relation to disability. But it also means that because eugenics was not only about ability and disability, but also about various markers of unfitness, so related to race, class, and also kind of intersecting with gender and reproduction as well. So that means that these injustices, the extent to which individuals would be experiencing these or targeted for them, would depend upon each person's particular identity and experiences. And for settler colonial nations such as Australia or US or Canada as well, there's increasing research, including by First Nations people, which is exploring the role of disability institutions in settler colonialism and in dispossession and genocide. So additional to all of these harms themselves, when people tried to advocate, to seek some recognition of what was happening, to try and stop it, or some kind of redress, they were often met with punishment, or for family members, they might be excluded from being able to continue having contact with the family member. And so this kind of gives rise to what Jill Stauffer refers to as moral abandonment. So the idea of being subjected to harm to only then additionally have the community fail to recognise that harm. So you're effectively abandoned by society's codes, moral codes of what's right and wrong. So it's important to note that disabled people weren't passive objects in this process of institutionalisation. So within the limits of these conditions, disabled people did resist and advocate, and many survived. And the contemporary self-advocacy movement in the US and Australia and elsewhere is emerged out of institutionalisation. So to illustrate the experience of institutionalisation, I just wanted to share the words of an Australian disability advocate, Kim Walker, who was in an institution for around, I think, 15 or so years, from the age of 2. And Kim says in her life story, her published life story, "I was very little when I was put into that institution. I felt very lonely. I couldn't speak, and so I couldn't express myself. No one listened to me. As a result of my communication problems, I developed a lot of behaviour problems. No one loved me or hugged me. I got punished a lot. I did not trust people. The people who looked after me came and went, and there was no one who looked out for me. The staff would often hit the children, or they would get the other kids to laugh at you if you made a mistake. If you were really bad, you were strapped into a chair, then the chair was laid down and you were hosed with the hose. I was only put in the chair once. Other things that happened were that people threw buckets of water over you to wake you up, or they made you stand in a corner and would not let you eat breakfast. Often you were given cold food, or you got the same food. When children grew up in institutions like the ones where Kim was, they never feel like they belong anywhere. They never get hugged. They are not loved. You feel like you are not a person. You're just one of the numbers. You don't feel like a whole person. You're just someone to be looked after and then moved along to the next person and then the next. You're not a child, only a part of the system. An institution is not a place for anyone. The next slide. So deinstitutionalisation started happening in the mid-20th century, and this involves closure of institutions and movement of disabled people into the community. And there were lots of different reasons that institutions started to be closed to save money. There were lots of, there began to be some media coverage of the conditions in institutions. There was changing social attitudes about disability, and there was advocacy by disabled people and litigation as well. And the image on this slide is the historical marker for Penhurst, the institution I mentioned before, which explains some of the context for its closure and identifies media and litigation as being important. So while we've had decades of deinstitutionalisation, it's important to note two things. One is that we still have disability institutions operating, and some disability institutions are only now closing. And while I'm focusing on those kind of large residential settings that historically operated, it's also important, and this is my second point, that when those big kind of stereotype disability institutions closed, other forms of institution-like conditions have emerged or have continued to operate. So group homes, segregated employment, segregated schools, all still operate. Nursing homes, so for disabled older people, they're a flourishing and a booming industry as well, very profitable. So even though we've had deinstitutionalisation, we haven't had the end of these political circumstances for disabled people. So the continuity of injustice then reflects the idea of disability institutions as part of structural injustice. So Iris Marion Young describes structural injustice as a kind of moral wrong that's incapable of being attributed to a specific perpetrator or the specific actions or policies of a state. So structural injustice has more kind of diffused, widespread and long-term dynamics grounded in social, political and legal structures. So if we think about disability institutions in that way, even though the physical buildings might close, the structures and systems that enable those injustices continue to support and manifest in other ways. And this kind of ongoing existence of segregation, incarceration and so on also suggests that beyond the material manifestation of this injustice in the form of disability institutions, we can also think of this injustice in terms of what Catherine Braun refers to as injuries of normality. So this refers to cultural logics that position oppressed groups as capable of violation because they're considered to be abnormal. So kind of, I guess, a kind of cultural underpinning of the idea of eugenics. And we see this in the disability context because even though many of these big buildings have closed, the cultural ideas of ableism continue into the present and underpin many contemporary laws, professional practices, systems, physical environments in relation to disabled people, and perhaps are less visible because they're often cloaked in ideas of benevolence or even more perversely, inclusion and rights. Next slide, please. Okay, so then returning to the idea of institutions closing, commonly we think of deinstitutionalisation as itself delivering justice to disabled people. So by this I mean if we close the buildings and move folks out of these buildings, well then we've stopped the bad things from happening in those spaces because people aren't there anymore. And in moving people into the community, then we can expect they're going to have a better life. And to some extent this is true. So research that was done tracking disabled people that moved out of Penhurst, for example, established that overwhelmingly deinstitutionalisation did have a positive impact on all those individuals. And additionally, that family members, even if they were hesitant at first about this occurring over time, also agreed that this was the best outcome for their family member as well. But stopping harm, so putting an end to what happened in institutions, is not the same as recognising and repairing that past harm. So stopping the harm does not necessarily give us a full sense that justice has occurred. And this is for a number of reasons. So individuals continue to be impacted psychologically, physically, economically by their experiences in institutions. These aren't automatically erased from people's bodies and minds when they leave the institution. Also, laws, systems, knowledge, and practice continue to be shaped by ableist and eugenicist logics that drove disability institutions. So closing doors of these buildings doesn't necessarily change the attitudes of the community, nor, as Dr. Shalish mentioned before, nor is this necessarily going to change how disability is taught at university, or the way professionals view disabled people, or what the law says can happen to disabled people. And this means, as Carrie, Ben Mosh and Chapman argue in their book, Disability Incarcerated, and I've included an image of the book cover on this slide, this means that coercion, exclusion, and violence against disabled people continues within the community, and so we haven't necessarily stopped the violence, but also we haven't acknowledged and redressed those past injustices. And so closing institutions' doors does not provide an opportunity in itself to acknowledge people's experiences as wrong, to hold governments and others accountable for what happened, or to learn from these complex and harmful experiences so those harms don't happen again. And I think that is reflected in the very fact that these harms still occur in kind of evolved and adapted to the community context. So this means that disability institutions are, to borrow from Maria Tumarkin, who was writing in the context of gendered violence, disability institutions are an open wound which refuses to scab, let alone heal. And these institutions, even if they've closed or even if they don't physically exist anymore, they continue to haunt the present. And I mean that word in the sense used by Avery Gordon as an unresolved social violence. So the fact that we have no redress means that these institutions are still present with us and still shaping contemporary conditions. Next slide, please. So this tension between deinstitutionalisation and justice is further complicated by what happens to former disability institution sites. So we might think these sites don't matter anymore once folks are out. They're just buildings like any other buildings to be used or demolished. But these places become holders of memory. They're the physical evidence of what happened. And there are activists and scholars who have argued that when we destroy sites of harm, we're actually erasing the memories and experiences of what happened there. We make it easier as a community to forget what happened and to deny people any recognition or justice. And we can think of many other contexts probably where, memorials in the US or internationally are really important for the community to not forget and to remember about what happened so that those harms aren't repeated. And Abbas and Veronka make this argument in the context of former sites of disability institutions. So they argue that demolition and redevelopment results in erasure of those experiences in history. Now, there are many sites of former disability institutions that have, there are many ways that these sites have been dealt with. And I probably I'll rush through this bit because I realise I might be running out of time. I haven't even got to reparations yet. So there's various uses, including, I'll just go to the next slide. So one way in which disability institutions can have their history erased sometimes is through redevelopment for other institutional uses. So, for example, some are reused as university campuses. So the College of Staten Island has a campus on the former institution site of Willowbrook State School. Willowbrook State School was the site of extreme harm and terrible conditions. For example, individuals were subjected to medical experimentation related to hepatitis. The place was overcrowded. There was sexual and physical violence there. Another way in which institutions physically might be have that history erased is through being redeveloped into housing. So the image on this slide is of a former disability institution in my home state called Stockton. And the image on the left is from a news article of an announcement a couple of weeks ago that the government is going to redevelop 500 houses on that site. Next slide, please. Disability institutions might also be used as haunted attractions. So here the property isn't demolished or kind of repurposed, but is instead the historical character of those places is kind of exploited for commercial and sensational reasons, purposes. So there might be people performing various haunted characters, often involving aspects of disability or tropes associated with institutions and medical violence, such as straitjackets or lobotomies, or it might involve ghost tours or paranormal tours. So on this image is a screenshot of the website for a haunted house attraction that operates at the Penhurst site that I mentioned earlier, 2 hours from Rutgers. And on that webpage, you see the word asylum in red text across the page. Even though it was a state school and hospital, it was never an asylum. We can see that kind of exploitation of the ideas and tropes around an asylum and kind of exploitation of the violence associated with that term. The other image is a screenshot of a website for a business operating in Australia called Tasmania's Most Haunted that has run ghost tours on the grounds of the former Willow Court Disability Institution. Slide, please. So disability institutions can also be reused for recreational or tourist uses. So the image on this slide on the left is about the Walter E. Fernald State School in Waltham, Massachusetts, about 4 hours from Rutgers. It's a news report from a few months ago saying that the council who owns the site is going to put a children's amusement park on the site. And the other image there is of a former disability institution site on an island that now runs as a sport camp for kids. My daughter has gone there. Next slide, please. Institutions can also be abandoned. So they're not seen as having any purpose or value, and they're not maintained and in a respectful way. So on this slide, I've got some images of Penhurst. I visited there while in the US, and it was abandoned for many years, and there's signs of damage and graffiti to the inside of the buildings. Okay, so if institutions caused harm, why and how do we redress that harm? So scholars give us some philosophical or conceptual reasons why we need to redress this harm. I referred to Iris Marion Young earlier. In a similar vein, Margaret Urban Walker argues that an impacted community continues to live with harm that has occurred in the past, and it continues to grossly distort relations between individuals and between groups in the present. So this gives rise to responsibility to address that injustice now, a responsibility for what she says is the past as the living present. And these kinds of arguments about the importance of addressing structural or historical injustice now have been made primarily in relation to racial harm, but we can definitely also apply this idea to disability institutions as well. Slide, please. So there are also human rights reasons for specifically redressing the injustice of disability institutions. So the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which I think America has signed but not ratified, but which Australia has signed and ratified, so it's maybe a little bit more practically relevant in Australia, but still normatively or morally relevant in the US. The CRPD, the convention, says that disabled people have the same rights as everyone else. So they have the right to equality, freedom from detention, freedom from violence, right to access justice. And they also have the right to independent living. So this is the idea, the right not to live in an institution, to choose where they live and be supported to live where they choose. And recently, the United Nations, in relation to that right of independent living, released guidelines on deinstitutionalisation. And these are designed to help governments with closing institutions and supporting people to live in the community. And one part of these guidelines is specifically on redress, remedies, and reparations. So it tells governments that they need to provide systems of redress to recognise all forms of human rights violations in institutions. And the guidelines also identify truth commissions to investigate and promote public understanding of what happened in institutions as also being required. And so next slide, please. So, so we have, I guess, a kind of philosophical reason for redressing the harms of disability institutions, and we also have a kind of normative or human rights basis for that. So let's now turn briefly to what truth-telling and reparations are. So truth-telling is central to redressing harm because it responds to the way in which governments and communities will often distance themselves from harm or engage in practice that kind of try to erase that record of that harm from collective memory. The need for truth is apparent at multiple levels. So victims and their families need truth for existential reasons. To be able to exist, they need some sense of recognition of the experiences of survivors. And the public needs truth as a means of ensuring transparency and protecting human rights. International human rights law recognises the right to truth, and this consists of obligations on the government in relation to three kinds of truth. We have structural truth, which is ascertaining the political and administrative structures that allowed the abuse to take place. We have individual truth, which is investigating the fate of particular individual victims or survivors. And then we have narrative truth, which is providing victims the opportunity to tell their story. And when we talk about truth-telling, we're thinking about narrative truth. And so this truth-telling is when there's testimony, particularly by witnesses and victims, but also participation sometimes by offenders in people providing their perspective as a way to gain some understanding, but also accountability for past wrong as well. And sometimes governments set up truth commissions to provide forums for this truth-telling. And there's examples such as the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In Australia, we have some truth-telling initiatives happening. And of course, in the US, there's growing truth commissions in relation to racial injustice. Slide, please. So then what does the term reparations mean? Well, often we might think of redress as compensation, as money ordered by the courts, but reparations is broader than this. It's a form of redress for human rights violations, and it can be delivered to individual victims, but also can be delivered to an entire community. And reparations aren't dependent on harm being illegal, particularly because often mass human rights violations are allowed by laws, are allowed by the government. It would be a further injustice if reparations were conditional on the violations being illegal under domestic law. So there are 5 categories of reparations. I'll just speed through these because I know I'm running out of time. Compensation, which is some kind of monetary recognition of damage or harm experienced. Restitution, which is restoring an individual to their prior position. Rehabilitation, which is medical or psychological support or legal and social services. Satisfaction, which is taking measures aimed at stopping the harm, recognising what happened, public apology, commemoration, memorialisation, and then guarantees of non-repetition, which are actions directed towards preventing further harm. And the image on this slide is of the Chicago torture reparations program relating to police torture, and that includes 6 forms of redress, including apology, counselling, compensation, college support for survivors and their children, and public education memorials about the injustice. Slide, please. Okay, so let's turn then to disability institutions and how this might play out in the context that we've been looking at. Slide, please. So disability rights advocates and disability justice activists have long argued for truth-telling and reparations. This isn't something that's just been invented by academics, but definitely comes from what disabled people themselves are asking for, demanding. So my colleague, Jack Kelly, who is a disability rights advocate and researcher with intellectual disability, has been calling for an official apology for disability institutions in Australia. Also in Australia, a recent report, which I highly recommend, looks at the mental health system and calls for a restorative approach that includes a truth and reconciliation process and a public apology. And also disability justice activists call for transformative change, and that inherently, while not necessarily labelled as reparative or reparations, involves the kind of structural and systemic change that reparations requires as well. Okay, so turning then to some examples where we are seeing redress and reparations already. There are redress initiatives happening in relation to eugenics-related sterilisation laws. Particularly in the US, a number of states, California, Indiana, North Carolina, Oregon, South Carolina, and Vermont, have introduced compensation-based, so monetary payment-based redress schemes for people who are sterilised under eugenics legislation. We've also seen some redress in Canada and Japan as well. And there's also been redress initiatives in Europe as well, such as Czech Republic, Denmark, Germany, and Sweden. Now, there have been many criticisms of these because while they do provide some monetary recognition of what people were subjected to, they've been criticised as being inaccessible, not being trauma-informed, too narrow in their eligibility, really over-reliant on people locating documentation to establish their eligibility, which we can imagine could be quite difficult as well. And interestingly, this is the main context in which compensation payments have been made to disabled people. So we haven't seen so many once an institution closes, we haven't seen compensation being delivered to all the individuals that were there. There have been some redress schemes for institutional child sexual abuse, particularly in Commonwealth nations such as England, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and so on. But these schemes are not specific to disabled people, but will provide some redress to children who were in relevant institutions. But again, very narrow, so focused on individual instances of sexual abuse rather than recognising the kind of whole experience of being institutionalised as itself unjust. Next slide, please. There've also been some truth commissions. So in 2022, the Vermont General Assembly passed legislation to create a Truth and Reconciliation Commission on structural discrimination. So this isn't specifically on disability, but it focuses on, I think, 4 or 5 marginalised populations, and one of those is people with disability and their families. Also, in 2023, the Massachusetts government established the Massachusetts Commission on the History of State Institutions for People with Disability, and this commission will produce an official report, I think next year, on the history of institutions in Massachusetts and recommendations for policy change. And this is probably the most progressed development in terms of truth-telling and reparations. It itself is not, I guess, a kind of truth-telling forum. It isn't focused on taking individual public testimony and people's lived experiences in that way, but is more probably about that the kind of official truth in terms of ascertaining or producing an official history of what happened, but also identifying the kind of the historical legacies of institutions in the sense of identifying where people's records are, how people can access them, a list of burial locations of where people are now located, and also looking at issues of memorialisation as well. And this commission is quite interesting because it emerged out of a protest by local disability activists against a Christmas lights display that was run by the local Lions Club on the grounds of the old Bagnoud institution, the one where the amusement park is being developed now. And so I've included here a screenshot image of the protest webpage, and on that is the slogan "Disability Rights, Not Christmas Lights," over a black and white photo of children, which presumably were children who were in the institution. So it's interesting in terms of social movements or in terms of disability rights activism, how that initial resistance to the kind of erasure of the injustice on that place then gave rise to this more official government-supported process of recognition and potentially in time reparations. So communities are also engaging in truth-telling and reparations, often because of the failure of government to take action. I'm probably out of time, so I'll speed through these very quickly. So one example is place-based memory projects or sites of conscience, which involves communities re-engaging with sites of harm to communicate those experiences to the public and connect them to current day issues. And the Penhurst Memorial and Preservation Alliance is a site of conscience organisation, and it's involved in supporting history tours on the site of Penhurst, which is also, as I mentioned before, being run as a haunted attraction at night as well. And I've included on that slide some images from a few weeks ago when I went on the history tour. Also, next slide, please. Also, the Fernald institution that I just mentioned, there's a cemetery attached to that institution that has a lot of unidentified graves. So there's nearly 300 people buried there, and the only markers are a C or P, Catholic or Protestant, and a number that denotes the order in which they were buried. And so local people have been working to research the identities of those people buried there in order to give them stories and humanize them, connect them with their family members who are still living, and also the local communities involved in maintaining that site. Next slide, please. Memoirs can also be a form of truth-telling. So I read before from the life story of Kim Walker, but there are other examples. So Roland Johnson, an African-American man who was in Penhurst State School and Hospital, his memoir, you can purchase that to read. Kim Walker's memoir is available online for free for download. But also siblings, family members have written memoirs from their perspective, not the lived experience of people in institutions, but this memoir by Victoria Freeman provides a really rich account of the complex impacts on siblings, for example, of having a sibling removed from the family. Next slide, please. And also, universities are engaged in projects to research the experiences of and archives of people who were in institutions. And one example is in Connecticut. The university there is attached to the Mansfield Training School, and students there are involved in helping to research for an online museum. Next slide, please. And also, I mentioned at the start the connection between disability institutions and settler colonialism. And First Nations people have engaged in their own practices of reconnecting with kin and remembering and healing. And Professor Susan Birch, who is a disability historian, has written about the former Canton Asylum for Insane Indians, where family members and communities are reconnecting with that place and honouring those who were there. So I'll conclude now. So just to conclude, institutions cause harm, that's undeniable. And even though a lot of that might be thought to be in the past or the buildings have shut down, it still remains our responsibility as nations, communities and professionals to find ways to reckon with and redress this harm. And that's an imperative for all of us. We're all connected in some way to disability and disabled people, and many of us benefit from, in direct and indirect ways, from these histories and ongoing practices of harm. And we might not have perpetrated the harm in institutions, but these harms continue to matter now for individuals and families and communities. And they continue to matter because they continue to shape current laws, systems and practices and education and so on. So we can all play some part in moving forward from that. That said, there are many issues still we need to think through accessibility and inclusion in relation to truth-telling and redress, thinking about how we both address the material impacts of institutions as well as the kind of cultural impacts around the kind of logics of ableism and eugenics. The role of families in redress is a really complex area, and also the role of charities, professionals and universities. And Professor Shalish kind of flagged this at the start, that we really need to think about our role, our institutions' roles. And also it's important to think about intersectionality, particularly for us in settler colonial nations, to think about how the harms of institutions intersect with the ongoing harms of colonisation. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Steele, for those words and for your time today. Do we have time for maybe 2 questions, if that's okay? And then I know you have to get going. Okay.
No. I mean, yeah, I'm happy to stay for as long as needed. So that's fine.
We have one question just to dive in, and for audience members, you're welcome to use the Q&A feature too if you're thinking of a question that you wanted to ask. This question, so for institutions and colleges and universities who might be working on apologies, how should these be crafted? What should they include, and who should they acknowledge?
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's a massive question. And I guess, and I'm not trying to get out of answering, but I think what I would say is that that's a question that I can't answer, but I can answer by saying that what I mean by that is that that process of apologies or reparations or whatever that universities are engaging in really needs to be co-designed by and involve, to the extent disabled people want to be, involve disabled people or whoever the impacted community might be. So some research that I've done, which I couldn't talk about today, I've been doing research around these ideas of place-based memory projects and sites of conscience. Initially, I was very excited about these ideas and thought, this has to happen in relation to disability institutions. But then in talking with disability advocacy organisations, realised that, yes, of course, we can't assume that's what should happen or how things should happen. We need to work with disabled people to find out what they want, or so how they want the public to remember or learn about disability institutions. And so that research has really highlighted both the importance of disabled people informing any substantive output or outcome of what reparations looks like, but also that process itself is reparative, or that process itself is really important from a human rights perspective of inclusion and participation and leadership. So I would imagine that any process within a university, and it's great that universities are doing this, would really need to involve disabled people the whole time, and be accessible and inclusive in that process as well, noting different forms of communication and information reception and so on.
Thank you. And our last question, how can Black and Indigenous reparations and disability reparations projects work together?
Yeah. So I think this is a really, important area, and one that hasn't necessarily been explored a lot. But in the Australian context, we recently had a Royal Commission about violence against disabled people. And there was a big focus on First Nations people with disability. And there's a great First Nations deaf disabled scholar called Scott Avery, who wrote a report for the Royal Commission on truth-telling in relation to First Nations people with disability. So that, and I can share that link with Professor Shalish. But yeah, so I think there is some practice and knowledge that's obviously already there in terms of what First Nations and racialized people are doing, but there's starting to become more public information about how non-disabled or non-Indigenous people can support those initiatives. So I think it's still very early days in terms of official recognition of those intersections, but certainly in Australia, we are starting to look at that in terms of, having processes of truth-telling that are considered culturally safe and recognise the intersectional complex impacts of disability-related harms situated in a broader colonial context.
Well, thank you, Dr. Steele, for your enlightening words today. Very powerful and moving. We're grateful that you were a part of our work for this Sawyer seminar series with the Mellon Foundation, and for the work that you continue to do on disability and reparations. We're really grateful. Thanks
Thank
to
you for having me. Thank you.
Oh,
And thank you to the signers as well.
you'll come in person next time. Yeah, we'll figure out a way. And thanks to the audience members and to Sorensen for interpreting today. Have a nice afternoon, everyone. Thank you.